How long did it take you to come to an understanding that what you went through was assault, that you were a victim?
We have this trope that victims, claim rape to avoid accountability, but in order to come forward with an allegation, you are essentially taking accountability for every mistake you've ever made in your life, and you're putting a target on your back. And in my situation, I knew what would happen if, Matt Lauer at that point at NBC could literally do no wrong. So it was unthinkable to imagine that it could be anything other than a misunderstanding. And it took me years, because what I felt was, why did I become a completely different person? Why am I doing these things that I don't even understand why I'm doing? This was someone I had idolized and trusted since I was a little girl. I'd been watching him since, before school, since I was in elementary school. And he was seen as the Today Show. He was old enough to be my father. My brain almost just could not compute the idea that he could do anything wrong. So in a situation where one person can do no wrong, and you are the person that is supposed to keep that person happy, the only conclusion you can reach is that it has to be your fault. It must have been something I did, something I said. Why did I put myself in that position? When you're in a position of power over someone, and you see someone who's young enough to be your daughter, who is drunk and alone in a foreign country, the normal response is to want to protect them, to want to help them. It's not to try to take advantage of them. But because I was so steeped in this culture, it took me years to see that.
You said it took you 6 years to write this book. Tell us about that journey.
I wanted to write the book because I had questions and I wanted answers. And in the aftermath of Me Too, if you didn't understand why consent was so complicated, why it was harder than if yes means yes and no means no, it felt like you couldn't even say that out loud, because you would be seen as part of the problem. You'd get canceled. And I was this person who'd made this incredibly consequential sexual harassment complaint, and I didn't understand it.
You talk about consent, and I think that is such a key part of your book. And both you and Matt Lauer, you say what happened, right? In terms of there were sexual relations on numerous occasions. In 2019, Lauer released a lengthy open letter. This was his first big response. And he says, "The story Brooke tells is filled with false details intended only to create the impression this was an abusive encounter. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was absolutely nothing aggressive about that encounter. Brooke did not do or say anything to object. She certainly did not cry. She was a fully enthusiastic and willing partner. At no time did she behave in a way that made it appear she was incapable of consent. She seemed to know exactly what she wanted to do. The only concern she expressed was that someone might see her leaving my room. She embraced me at the door as she left." How do you respond to that?
Is that easy for me to hear? No. It's devastating. It makes me feel ashamed. But at the same time, I listen to that and I can't believe I was ever alone in a room with that person. When you are in a position, when you are with a subordinate that you have personally witnessed drink for hours, you have paid for the drinks, when that person, as I did, in my case, I wrote an email making jokes about how I was so drunk I couldn't open my hotel room door. It's hard to fathom how you could argue that you're completely unaware that someone's ability to consent might be compromised. When you are in a position of power over a subordinate, and you know that that subordinate's job is essentially to do whatever they have to do to keep you happy, that they really can't ignore your emails, that they really can't even make you mad, you are responsible for making sure that you're not taking advantage of them. And when I hear that, when I hear anyone in a situation where they are sexually propositioning a subordinate that they know has been drinking for hours, that they've witnessed drink for hours, it just tells me they're not all that concerned about consent in the first place.
Who do you envision as the readers of your book? Like, who were you writing for?
I remember what it felt like to read other women talking about what happened to them, to hear them saying things that I thought I had to have been the only one to have felt that way, to have been in that position, to have reacted that way. And that moment where you realize you're not alone, that changes everything. So obviously, I want to be able to do that for other women. I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to do this. But it's also, I know what it feels like not to understand this stuff.
Because you really tackle the gray area head on when it comes to sexual assault in this book.
I remember being in newsrooms and, hearing these stories, and we would cherry pick the black and white ones, the ones where it was a likable victim that we thought would be easy to understand, that didn't get into these messy gray areas. But the reality is the gray area is the norm. And until we understand that, victims who react in perfectly normal ways are going to continue to feel the way I did, which was alone and like they're losing their mind. You think, what happened to me can't possibly be a sexual assault because I didn't react the way a real rape victim did. Well, yes, you did. We just have the wrong ideas about how victims react.
Tell us more about that in terms of the expectation societally of how a victim should act versus the reality.
Our standards for victims in the aftermath of a sexual assault are impossibly high. We expect them to immediately recognize what happened as a sexual assault, when we know that's rarely what happens. These situations are confusing, they're devastating, and one of the most common reactions to it is denial. We expect them to immediately report what happened and to tell their stories consistently, when in fact, nobody tells the same story the same way every single time. It takes time to understand what happens to you, to come to terms with it. And when we see victims doing that, we accuse them of being inconsistent. If they are, if they do tell the story the same way every time, then we say, oh, you're rehearsed. It is really an almost impossible position for victims in the aftermath of assault. And it's important to recognize that a lot of the ways victims react, whether it's freezing, whether it's placating their abuser just to try and not make a bad situation worse, those are very normal reactions to trauma.
Let's talk a little bit more about the sense of control and trying to regain that after something like what you went through.
When it's someone you know that sexually assaulted you, someone with power over you, it's a lot more complicated than that. You're going to try and do whatever you can do to make it as though it never happened, because that's what you need to continue living your life. If you need to keep your job, if you need to keep someone in your family safe, you're going to do whatever you have to do to not make this situation worse. So if it's someone you work with, you're going to try and smooth it over. You're going to try and essentially keep them happy. And we see that again and again in these situations with power imbalances. And I know how hard that can be to understand, because we're comparing it against, if a stranger sexually assaults you in an alley, obviously you're not going to chase them down and invite them for coffee. But if it's your boss, you can't ghost your boss. You can't just never show up at work again. You have to be able to continue living your life. and you get put in this impossible situation where you are placating your own abuser.
And you describe Lauer in your book as the superstar harasser, which further complicated the dynamic of you coming forward. What is the superstar harasser?
While I was researching this book, I interviewed a forensic psychologist who casually mentioned this EEOC report that I then looked up, and it describes these superstar harassers. It's a committee from the EEOC specifically warning employers in 2016 of these rainmakers that are perceived to be so valuable to a company that they can do no wrong. Instead of having people to hold them accountable, they have groups of people to keep them happy. And because they have so much power, they feel as though the rules don't apply to them, and they see people with less power as essentially disposable. And when you think about it, you know, if you are a nurse in an operating room and the surgeon is someone who's the only person that can do this life-saving operation, and, you know, they sexually harass you, are you going to be the person that goes forward and makes the complaint that means they can't save someone's life that day? No, of course you're not. And that's how you get these cultures of open secrets where everyone knows about this behavior but feels like they can't talk about it. So I read this report, and it described almost to a T what had been happening to me, what was happening all across the Me Too movement. You know, we saw it everywhere, and even now we still see it. We're still seeing it today.
And you write in your book, quote, "So many of our deepest assumptions about what a real victim should look like and how they should behave remain firmly entrenched. As a result, the process of coming forward is still, broadly speaking, nightmarishly complicated and often self-defeating." So help us better understand what you mean by that societal expectation of a real victim, and why you, in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath, didn't come forward.
My job was to smooth things over for the talent. So I thought, this I know how to do. I can smooth this over. And so I went back. And when I went back, the first thing that happened was he suggested I come meet him in his apartment. And when you're sitting in the dressing room of the anchor of the Today Show in Studio 1A, are you really in a position to say no? Of course you're not. And that just happened again and again. And the most confusing part of it was that every single time I thought I was fixing it, I was taking back control, but really what I was doing was implicating myself in my own abuse. And then by the time I understood that I was trapped, I knew I was going to be blamed for all of it, and I blamed myself.
Do you still blame yourself?
I was a journalist who had covered stories of sexual harassment, high-profile stories of sexual harassment and assault. If I had been better at my job, if I had been a better journalist, I might have been able to make better choices. And I blame myself for that, and I will always blame myself for that. But to blame yourself in the aftermath of one of these situations is really just to blame yourself for being a human being. Everyone is vulnerable at some point in their lives, and most of the time, no one comes along and takes advantage of your vulnerability. That's just not what happened to me. And, you know, later, as you come to terms with what happened, you realize that all of those things that you said as you tried to work through it, whether you said them to your friend, to your therapist, to a member of the clergy, a text message you wrote, even your own journal, all that can be subpoenaed. So your normal human reaction to an incredibly devastating, confusing situation gets used against you. And it feels as though it's just not safe to be human. That's part of why you feel so alone in the aftermath of these situations. Because when you do decide, maybe I should go forward, maybe I should tell someone, you've already essentially testified against yourself. You've given your abuser reasonable doubt. And it's that way because we don't understand how people respond in these situations. We have these impossible expectations. I woke up in Sochi where everybody around me was an NBC employee. Who could I possibly talk to about what happened when every single one of us was relying on Matt Lauer and the Today Show to keep the news division afloat? Every single one of us is steeped in this culture of believing he could do no wrong. And, you know, as I was even driving home from the airport, someone I worked with called, you know, how was the trip? It was great. I'd already essentially given a witness against myself. And then when you go forward and you try to hold the other person accountable, you get blamed for a perfectly human reaction.
And you argue the power imbalance with that. If you're in a situation where you're of a high stature and you're with a subordinate, that even if the woman doesn't say no, that's not consent.
If you're risking everything you've ever worked for by potentially rejecting or alienating this person, you're in a position where you can't consent. Consent takes place between equals. It has to be freely given, and that's not what's happening in these situations. And if you are the person in power, you know that.
Another thing you hear, I guess, the myths around being a victim or what society thinks is, oh, well, the woman regrets it. So now she's saying she was raped because she cheated on a loved one, and so she's calling it rape even though it wasn't rape.
One of the ways that Me Too was not entirely successful is that it created an environment where it felt like you couldn't ask questions. It felt like you couldn't ask why victims go back, why they wait so long to report. We called out these powerful abusers, but then we didn't explain why that behavior was so problematic. And as a result of that, I think a lot of the reforms we made felt frankly arbitrary and stupid to a lot of people, which sort of invited the backlash that we're seeing now.
And you make clear that not every man's a predator. There have been false allegations made, which of course hurts the movement altogether, right?
I think that this believe all women all the time ethos that came out of Me Too, while well-intentioned, was actually misguided. It shouldn't be believe all women all the time. It should be stop disbelieving victims for the wrong reasons. We see a lot of normal victim behaviors as red flags. That means that we interpret as, oh, there's something fishy here. This can't be true, when really we know those are textbook behaviors. But what happens is, if you automatically disbelieve these stories, no one's ever gonna go to the police.
So then how do you determine if a sexual assault did take place, since there's typically no camera in the room to record what happened?
I wish I had a better answer for you. The reality is the system is stacked against victims. And one of the questions I asked myself while writing this book was, how can victims actually be believed? Because when you go down the dynamics of a he said, she said case, or a typical sexual assault allegation from the perspective of an investigator, it's devastating. You know, you are rarely going to have physical evidence. There's no chain of custody for human memory, and we know that human memory is not perfectly reliable. You know, we know you're essentially relying on two unreliable witnesses, and then you're putting a jury in a situation where they have to figure out what may be unknowable. And the good news is that the behavior of sex offenders and victims of sex crimes generally conform to pretty well-established behaviors. And, you know, forensic psychologists and experienced investigators, when they know what they're doing, they can generally get to the truth. And alcohol is kind of a perfect storm. You know, we have this notion of beer goggles that makes everyone look attractive, but studies have shown what alcohol actually does is make everyone around you seem more willing to have sex with you. And it lowers your inhibitions. It lowers your ability essentially to recognize risk and recognize vulnerability. So you get in these situations where you have one person who overvalues how interested someone is in having sex, and another person who can't recognize how vulnerable they are and is losing the ability to defend themselves, to remember what is happening to them. Because alcohol makes you forget. Like, we all know that when you drink, you start to lose memory. And our number one defense against bad things happening to us is the ability to hold someone accountable for it. So part of what makes sexual assault so traumatic is that if you know you've been drinking and you know that this bad thing is happening to you, you know that you're not going to be believed, which makes it terrifying and traumatic.
In your journey trying to get to the truth, you ended up in a psych ward.
I did. After I made my complaint, someone asked me, you know, how I was doing with the trauma of what had happened to me. And I was just like, I don't know what you're talking. I have plenty of problems, but trauma isn't one of them. I'm fine. And saying you're fine is avoidance. That's a classic symptom of PTSD that I didn't recognize. And while I was fine, I mean, I was carrying a flask of bourbon in my bag to get through the day. I was drinking at work. I was taking sleeping pills to sleep. I look back at that now and I can see very clearly that is a masking behavior. That's a pretty glaring indication that I was not fine. It was not until 9 months later, when I had been outed by a tabloid, I took a leave of absence from my job, that had essentially been my entire identity. You know, as long as I was a producer at NBC, then I had to have been okay, because I was doing this incredibly important, hard job that I loved. And all of a sudden, I wasn't fine anymore. I didn't want to live anymore. I couldn't live with myself anymore. I didn't have a structure to keep pretending I was fine, and I became really self-destructive. I was doing anything I could do to push the people in my life away. And fortunately, I was surrounded by people who saw what was happening, and they took me to get some help.
And one of the through lines in talking to women like you is just the shame that endures. And it may be less acute than it was. But how do you feel now all these years later?
I think it is really important to talk about what shame actually is, because we confuse shame with embarrassment, with all sorts of other things. But shame is this belief that there's something wrong with you, that what happened because of you. And it makes you want to hide from the world. It makes you feel like a fraud in your own life. And I wish I could say I never feel like that, but I still feel like that. I've felt like that in this conversation sometimes. You know, shame for me is something that feels dormant. I carry it with me always, and I feel it, and I decide to remember that it wasn't my fault, that I didn't deserve it, and I fight back. But it's still a struggle.
And you've shown, though, also that you're not defined by what you went through. You've moved on, you're married, you have 2 kids, and in many ways you live a beautiful life now that you probably couldn't have imagined before you went through all the therapy and the work that you did go through. Because you said, I just thought I was in this abyss and that was it.
It was actually when I was packing the suitcase to go to the hospital and have my daughter. It was the same suitcase I had taken to Sochi. And I found a luggage tag, my NBC Sochi luggage tag. And I saw it, and I wanted to lay on the floor in the fetal position all over again. But then I looked back and I remembered every single thing I did to get through what happened, to get out of the room, to keep my job, to report it. Those choices brought me to where I am today. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here.
What else do you hope will be a takeaway for readers from your book, especially in this moment we're in with this reporting out about these 2 members of Congress who have now resigned, and the reporting from CNN about Congressman Swalwell and the sexual misconduct allegations?
Even in the aftermath of Me Too, that this continues to happen, that people in positions of power often abuse that power. And when that happens to you, you often have nowhere to turn. And I know how devastating that is. I know how alone that feels, and I know the courage it takes to come forward. Until we talk about the messy gray areas, until we talk about how power impacts someone's ability to consent, how you have to have the power to say yes or no. You have to think about the position you're putting someone in. This is just going to keep happening. And that's why I wrote the book. We just have to do better.